What's up, everyone? This is Andre from Indie Arts Midwest. I decided to do yet another in-between video. I also wanted to make a video taking the rig and immediately started to animate, which I did. For the materials, they only have one attribute that is similar, and that is I set up the settings to basically only affect the area where the window is, and that's regardless of having any like extra features. It's literally just a color ramp connected from the base texture to the roughness. When I brought the scene assets in, they were smaller than the scale of the motorcycle. So the easiest thing for me to do was just join all the objects of the scene together and scale it up. Setting up the fog and the depth of field to build on my photorealism, which it kind of helped. I was very subtle about using any mist in the background, and it bounces around depending on what the render looks like. So I kind of base it on a few factors, and the same thing goes with the depth of field as well. All right, so bringing in my custom character just required me to scale him down to the scene size in the file that I appended it from, which is fine. I don't mind scaling it down, but either way, I just caught that detail. Put him next to the motorcycle. Did a few test renders just to get an idea if the scale looked proper. Next, I downloaded this helmet from Sketchfab. Did a quick, very basic setup. Pivot point was in a perfect spot, so I didn't have to worry about setting that up. I'm not the best at making glass, and I feel like this particular setup looks better than my other setups in other renders for some reason. At certain angles, this one's okay once it completes rendering, but man, for the first few seconds there, it's kind of rough. But I really liked how I had the index of refraction set up looking in this particular angle. How I process and handle a lot of the renders and setups that I create, and many of you probably do as well. I have a backup file called Blender Procedural, which is where I keep all the baseline stuff. For some reason, I ran into a weird issue where setting the iterations to 60 on the IK legs made them do a raptor thing, but keeping it at 500 mitigated the issue. But what I'm finding now is that in my latest setup, I have it just simply set to 24 and it's fine. In fact, if I go lower than 24, it just straightens out his leg. But I'm not really sure why it was more responsive to the 500 iterations when I initially set this up. And this has nothing to do with you guys. This is just the character that I brought in from the bike. But that may have a lot to do with getting him to pedal properly. If I remember correctly, that's probably why this is set to 500. Parenting the suspension front and rear controls to the lean control instead of the main control objects from the front and rear suspension controller, and then reparent them to the lean controller rather than just the main controller. So I'm not sure why it was behaving in that manner, because the rotation for the swing arm is already set, and so was the rotation for the rear suspension controller. But after I cleared the parent, Z-min to -1 and max to 1. I ended up having to rotate it almost minus 140 degrees in order for it to function as it should. move on to the front, I still have a similar issue, but it just comes down to changing the settings within the transform object in order to get it back to how it was. It's just as simple as going into the settings and increasing the min and max until I got a ratio that I liked, which varies depending on whether it's a positive and an equalish negative or a drastically low negative and a positive as your min max. But either way, I just wanted a decent amount of rise and fall from the suspension. And of course, I utilized adding a shrink wrap transform for the front and rear in this video, which actually helps on a certain part where the curve doesn't quite match up with the surface. And so that's why I started my animation at frame 400, which is later on, as you'll see. But having the shrink wrap functionality gives me a solid view on, number one, knowing that the wheels are touching the surface, but also the rig can't go below the surface because of the constraints as well. So it's kind of cool. And the same goes for setting the main controller as a shrink wrap object constraint as well. Another factor is that I have nothing but flat surface on these particular renders that I'm setting up, so I don't really need to worry about ensuring that even though the front and rear wheel are shrink wrap constrained to the road surface, I don't really have to think about the angle of things so much. I had a concern that they would react to parts of the surface where the wheel wasn't located based on its Z rotation, and so that would give undesired effect. So I wanted to be able to animate that level of spin control within the setup as well. So that was going to come along with the video anyway. And just a Z rotation to see how they react to the turn, so we can see that there's like a realm of reaction control from the surface. Either way, I'm just pointing it out now in this particular part because the focus of this video is animation and rigging, which I look forward to tweaking even further if I can get the front and rear suspension controllers to better follow. I'm going to select the main controller and add a follow path object constraint and set it to the road curve. I also need to set the forward axis to X and the up axis to Z, and check follow curve. So here I'm just moving around, getting the bike close to the path because it auto snaps within the region of the path. So I'm just kind of placing it and rotating it a bit to give it a proper starting look. And it's about mid-frame because it's at frame 78 in this particular part of the video, but I do bump it up to 1,000. And so right now I'm just going to the first frame and setting a keyframe for the offset of the bike for the curve in relation to its current position, and then I go to frame 1000 and set the offset to -100, which puts the motorcycle at the end of the animation. Later on, I decided to bump that up to 5,000 so that I could get a lengthier cycle through the pathway. Cool, so now it's good from start to finish, and then I'm just going to rotate the motorcycle 180 degrees so that it's facing forward on the last frame here, and I too set its rotation. I'm just going to scrub through here, give it a quick play. We see that it's starting to auto rotate on its own. So what I ended up doing was jumping to different points within the animation, which were on a 100 scale. So I started with 100 and it looked okay all the way up until about frame 400. And so I set the rotation of the body to point straight and then moved up to frame 600, did the same thing, 800, same thing, 1000, same thing. So as we can see in this particular shot, I'm just testing out how the surface has an effect on the suspension height of the front lower fork and the swing arm, and has the effect I was going for in adapting to the road surface depending on the surface height. Taking a look at frame 1000, and I'm just going to rotate the body. Pointing the steering wheel was also a factor as well, as you have seen within the last few clips. They both need to be adjusted as you go along, but like I said earlier, having the looseness of this steering setup allows you to create a steering style that is more that caters to the type of character that you have controlling the motorcycle. I will say that setting up a curve object for the pathway in order, for your motorcycle to follow, I'm going to say mostly successful, because it took quite some time in order for me to realize that I made my subdivisions way too high. And in doing that, it created an effect where when the motorcycle followed the path, it would bounce around. And even though I used the smooth effect many, many times over, hoping that that would fix it, ironically, the only thing that actually solved the issue was actually was decimating the subdivisions of the curve path down to something more reasonable. And I mean, I'm just guessing by default, that kind of smooths things out between each node to the point where I cleared up my path following issue in terms of it bouncing around very quickly. By the time it got to 1000, it would have at least a set path towards the end. And from where I have it now, because I have a max of 5,000 frames before it reaches the ends, I've already seen that in the future I will have to set it up to rotate about 180 degrees about halfway through. And this last little chunk here, all right, let's just take a look from a few different camera views. Basically, I got this thing to follow the path smoothly just based on that alone. I guess I'll just say on behalf of the path, it did take some time to get that working, and I'm really glad that it finally did get working, because man, it was really rough for a good few hours trying to sort it out, all for it to come down to me decimating the path in order for it to smooth things out. My way to justify that is because it's an animation, you probably want the path following of your motorcycle to be fairly loose, which gives you room to animate minor things in between, or just outside of, or within, I don't know, however you want to look at it, the realm of the path that it's following. So that gives you room to add all of your leans if you want or need to, depending on what's going on. You can actually set that down to the frame. So really, the path following being imperfect, in addition to how loose the rig follows, kind of go hand in hand in that. I think that's kind of cool. I hope you found this information useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching.